Welcome to the end of Project 11. We are dealing with the node controller response curve editing functionality. Let me pull up the plugin and you can see what's going on. Let me reset all of this to the default state. Okay, all right. What you are implementing is this functionality right here. Okay, you can click on these nodes and you can drag them, and then you can also click on these nodes and adjust the queue of each node. Okay, so that's pretty handy. This is really tricky to implement, so I'm going to show you some of the basic functionality. Okay, so clicking on the nodes and dragging it adjusts the band itself. You can click on the band itself and adjust it that way. You can double click on a node to reset it to its default position. You can double click on a queue control to reset it to its default value. Sometimes it's tricky, and this is like this is one of the things that you get to try to control, is whether or not you can control like the hit detection area. Like basically, if I've got my cursor, you can see how close I have to get my cursor for this to actually say that like I'm over it. Okay, this is one of the problems that you have to learn how to deal with. Okay, I'm going to talk about what each of these parts are. Okay, so these little red dots, let me move this over here. Let's get rid of Project 12. Okay, these little red dots, these are instances of analyzer node. Analyzer node is basically just a data source. It doesn't draw anything. All of the drawing happens in analyzer widget base, and all this class does is just draw any ellipse at basically the bounding box for this component. It's like the full size of it. The analyzer band, this class right here, this is basically this colored rectangle that you see going on in the background. It switches what is drawn based on the chain position and then the channel. So right now we're only displaying stereo mode, we're only displaying left channel, but as soon as I turn on dual mono mode and move some of these nodes around so they're not overlapping, you can see that this one is this color. These guys are both shades of red. This is kind of this whitish shade. This is similar to that. Here's this color, and then this one's slightly different. They're basically like, you know, things on the left channel, things on the right channel are slightly less bright than the things on the left channel. You can see when I mouse over these that this stuff down here changes as well. Okay, so there's a whole whenever you mouse over these things, it notifies all of the things here to update what parameters they are displaying. That's not easy to implement because it's a whole like listener system and saying like, hey, reattach to this parameter, that sort of thing. Okay. Another thing, when you bypass a parameter, it disappears. Or sorry, when you bypass a band, it disappears from the list of nodes that can be moused over. So when you put it back, then you get these hit detection rectangles, and it gets added to that list and all the good stuff that comes with that. Okay, I was talking about analyzer band. Okay, analyzer queue control. That is when you click on a node itself, like click on the actual node. If you click, yeah, you got to click on the node itself to see them, and then when you mouse over them, the cursor changes and you can drag them. The instructions say how to do that, and that's just calling set mouse cursor. Again, this uses the same paint code that's in analyzer widget base. It's drawing an ellipse, but the ellipse itself has a width of 2 and a height of whatever this thing is, which is why it looks like a vertical line. Okay, let's move on to the node controller. And I think the best way to explain how to get this thing functional is to just show you all the parts that I used in it and explain what that part was for. So the first thing you're going to need to do is you need to override all of the mouse listener functions. Okay, mouse down, mouse move, mouse up, mouse drag, mouse enter, mouse exit, mouse double click. Okay. There are two different modes. Basically, you're going to do some certain things whenever the queue control is not displayed, and then you're going to do other things when the queue control is displayed. All right, so for the mouse down, this is basically what you do. Okay, you start the drag operation. you start the gesture for the parameter, and then you notify the listeners. Okay, now this is what you do for the node, and this is what you do for the band. On the Q control, you start the drag, you start the gesture, and you start notifying the listeners. And if you're just clicking on the node controller class itself, you're not going to do anything. You're just going to notify the listeners. So let's take a look at what the listeners are that I'm talking about over here. So this notify of band selection function. All right, I've got this listener. Let's see where that is. That's over here. Okay, so there's this listener class, and basically whoever inherits from node controller listener, they are going to respond to if a band is moused over, if a band was selected, and then if the selection needs to be cleared. Part of the reason that this functionality existed was because at one point in time, well, actually you can see what's going on here. If I mouse over these guys, you can see that like their color changes from white to green when I mouse over an active band. The other thing is like when I do band moused over, you can see that it's switching between the left and the right. So here I'm on the right channel. Here now I'm doing the left channel. Here I'm doing the left channel. Here's the node for the right channel. Here's the node for the, what band is this? Here's the node for the right channel. Here's the node for the left channel. Okay, so that's how this listener functionality works, okay? And it uses the regular listener list pattern where you add listeners to it and remove listeners. And then the listener call functionality is right here, where all you do is just say, I'm saying that a band was moused over, and then which band, let me know which band was moused over. It's let me get the chain position from it, and let me get the channel from it. Okay, so again, this is like a very complicated piece of technology that's going on that you get to figure out. All right, the storage of all of these things. Okay, these are all stored as unique pointers in the nodes. There's an array of 16 nodes because you have 8 bands, followed by, if you're in stereo mode, you only see 8 of them. If you're in dual mono mode, you see 16 of them. Okay, there's 8 nodes, there's 8 bands, times 2. All right, and then you have parameter attachments for each of these. Basically what happens is when you click and drag a node, you are modifying both the frequency and either the gain or the slope. And then if you click on the left and right analyzer Q controls, you're modifying the quality, okay? So all of this stuff needs to get set up, okay? When you click and drag on one of these components, a dragger is used to facilitate all that stuff. And then there's a custom constrainer, and the purpose of this is to make it so that you can't drag these controllers, you can't drag these little nodes further than the parameter limits. So for gain, I believe it's 18. Let's see, no, it's plus 24. Okay, so I can't go above the plus 24. All right, and I can't go below the negative 24. All right, so that's what the component bounds constrainer is doing. And then it's also saying you can't go past the edge right here, 20 hertz, and you can't go past the 20 kilohertz. Oh, JSert. That's fine. No, you're going to explode. All right. Whoops. Continue. All right. Okay. I'm just going to keep doing that. Because it failed to push for some reason, probably because my FIFO is not big enough. That's one of the joys of the release pool. You already know about that. I think I set this to a size of 5000. That still wasn't big enough. How big is my FIFO? Well, I'm not here to debug this, but let's just take a quick look. My FIFO, what does my FIFO have of a size of 512? It's supposed to be 5000. Oh, it's the deletion pool, that is. FIFO itself needs to be way bigger than this. I should just make that 5000. All right, let me rerun this. That was interesting. Okay, let me go back to where I was in the node controller. All right, so each of the nodes is attached to both a frequency parameter and a gain or slope parameter, and then the Q controls are attached to one of these quality controls. Okay, let's go on with the fun stuff. All right, we discussed the purpose of the dragger and the constrainer. All right, now we have an all params listener, and let me see what this thing does. All params listener, that's going to be way up here in the constructor, somewhere up here. All params listener. Basically, whenever a parameter changes, for instance, if you're using automation, it is going to refresh the positioning of the widgets. So the purpose of that is, if I'm here and let's say I'm just going to modify this one. If I drag this guy, you can see that the node moves. If I adjust this, the node moves. If I adjust this, the node moves. Okay, that's the purpose of the all params listener. All right, analyze your node area. This is the area that the nodes are allowed to move in. You can see it's like up to the 24, up to the plus 24 range and negative 24 range, plus half the width or half the size of the dot itself. That way the center of the dot lines up right on negative 24 or right on plus 24. Well, that's a little high right there. Okay, that's the purpose of that analyzer area. Okay, everything kind of gets constrained within there. All right, now for the, let me close project 12. Let me save this just so it's there. Okay, we're going to talk about the click position. Basically, whenever you adjust, whenever you click and drag, you need to track the difference in how the mouse was moved, okay? That's the way that this ends up working. Okay, so if I click right here, basically what happens is I track the dB level at the time of the mouse down. I convert the Y position to some dB level, and then I say, all right, my mouse moved from here to here. How many decibels was that? That was this much. Okay, then I need to subtract X amount from the parameter and send that as the new parameter value. That's going to be handled in your mouse drag. Now you need to do that for both if you're clicking in the band and if you're clicking on the Q controls. All right, for this one, you ignore the vertical, but you still have to figure out how far did this stuff change when you drag it from left to right. Okay, and it's very tricky. Okay, there's a flag for whether or not the Q controls are actually active, and now the big issue that I ran into was figuring out, like, what am I actually clicking on? If I click right here, I'm clicking on the controller. If I click here, I'm clicking on the band. If I click here, I'm clicking on the node. And if I click here, I'm clicking on the quality. So what I did was I used this thing called a widget type pair that it uses a tuple that has a pointer to one of these things. And then it has an index, and then there's a function where you pass in the mouse event, and it figures out what did you click on. And then based on that, based on whatever it returns, let's see, where does that get used? Widget type pair. Somewhere down here, it's like you tell it, where am I using this thing? Let's see, widget type pair is somewhere down here. Let me just look for it. Get component. All right, this is where it figures out, like, it basically does like a switch off of like what was the original component. If it's one of these things, then you're going to populate the tuple accordingly. Okay, so I'm going to show you an example for what happens in the for the mouse down function. Okay, so the first thing we do, we're going to talk about what happens when you click on the node. Okay, the first thing you do is you figure out what component was clicked on, and let's say that you clicked on the node itself. So we're going to use that widget pair thing. All right, we're going to use this. We're going to pull from this and figure out what it is. We know it's the node because it was stored in the pair.type. Okay. And then we're going to use this node, we're going to start dragging it, and it's just going to automatically handle the node dragging things. And then it's going to begin a gesture with the frequency that should be attached to the node. And then it's going to begin a gesture for the gain or the slope parameter that should be attached to the node. Then it's going to notify everybody, hey, this node was just clicked on. All right, and then from that point, the mouse event system, the next thing that happens is mouse drag. Okay, now in mouse drag, we do the same thing. You know, every mouse event, every time you move the little cursor, it's going to call this function. So we got to figure out what was dragged, and we know that it was the node type, and this is where we're going to drag it. We're going to update the parameter, and this is the set value as part of gesture. And then we also need to figure out if we're adjusting a cut filter or if we're adjusting something else instead. Okay, so if we are not adjusting a cut filter, then we need to figure out what our vertical dragging turned into, and in terms of decibels, and then we need to tell the audio parameter that this is the new value it should have. Modifying the audio parameter is going to update the response curve, and it's also going to update those sliders. If it is a cut filter, then we need to figure out what is the new slope to use. All right, and then as always, we notify the band. We notify the appropriate listeners. Okay, you're going to do the same thing for all of the other node types. Okay, so that takes care of how mouse drag works. Okay, for mouse enter, you're basically lighting things up or unhighlighting them. So it's like when I mouse inside of a band, I'm highlighting the band as well as highlighting the node. And then when I leave the band, the color changes. So if I go from this one to this one, you can see that this node right here went from red to blue, and then this node went from blue to red. Okay, so that's what mouse move does. All right, and then same for if I click on this, and the other things it does is if I mouse over the Q control, that lights up as well. And then if I mouse out of it, Q control gets hidden, and if I click on a node, Q control gets shown. So that's a whole thing right there under mouse down. Let's see, where is that? I think that's under mouse. Maybe I may have handled that via mouse down, or I may have handled it via mouse. I think it's under mouse up is where I tackled that. Yes, that's where I did. That's where I did that. In the mouse up, it's basically you clicked on a node, and you're not dragging it because it went mouse down and then not mouse drag. Instead, it went mouse down, then mouse up. So we know that we need to set that node to be displayed as selected, and then we also need to figure out, we need to adjust the Q controls, their positions, what channel they are attached to, and then whether or not they are visible. Okay? The reason for that is because when you are doing this, when we click on a Q control, it needs to pull it needs to know which parameter it's going to attach to. Remember, we create all of the analyzer nodes. They all get created and attached to their parameters right at the very beginning. But the Q controls can be attached to any parameter. So we do that by using those setter functions over here. Analyzer Q control, set the chain position and set the channel. Okay, that information gets pulled out when you click and drag on this. It looks up which parameter to modify based off of based off of the get chain position and get channel in the base class. Okay. Let's see what happens next. What happens next? All right, I'm going to go through the actual mouse event stuff in just a little bit. All right, so you know the purpose of this widget type pair thing. That's what this get component for mouse event does. Next we have get the frequency attachment for a particular analyzer widget base. Get the quality param. Get the gain or slope parameter. These basically use those functions make use of the get chain position and get channel to figure out which audio processor value tree state parameter they should be attached to. That's how those guys work. Let's see what happens next. Okay, we have these reposition nodes, get nodes, and he's updating reposition the node. Update node visibilities. All of this stuff is tied to when you modify this stuff or you modify these things, okay? So again, whenever a parameter is changed, if I go back up to that to the controller, if I go back to the constructor, all right, in the refresh widgets, first thing we do is we reposition all the nodes. Then we update the node visibility. So this basically, if you drag that slider, the node itself is going to reposition its X and Y position based off of the frequency and the gain. And then if the node is bypassed, we use update node visibilities here. Then we do the same thing with the bands. And then we refresh the bounding boxes. Basically, the way this works is, oh man, do I have that debug code that displays that stuff? I don't think this class has a paint function. At one point, I did have code that did display that. Yeah, I'm not going to try looking for that right now. But basically, I'm going to make this one really, really wide. But basically the bounding box between when the hit test says you're on this node versus when you're on this node is there's a border right here. There's a rectangle where the left edge is literally halfway between this dot and this dot. And if your cursor is on this side of it, you're doing this node. And then same for this node here and this node. There is it's invisible, but there's a rectangle that's drawing the right edge of it. The right edge of that rectangle for this node is halfway between this dot and this dot. And whenever the hit tests, whenever the node gets moved around, that rectangle gets repositioned. That's what this rebuild node selection bounding box is. Okay. If the Q controls are visible, the next thing that happens is they are repositioned based off of the Q value. And that value is computed in the rebuild node selection bounding boxes. That's over here. This is where we figure out, like, we compute it based off of the, let's see, is that where that goes? Reposition Q controls, where is this? Yeah, somewhere in here, when you adjust the Q controls, that stuff gets adjusted. I think it's maybe reposition bands. Okay, yes, reposition bands is where that thing happens. Okay, so, and that has to do with way up here in the, if you remember in the analyzer node, you have two rectangles, the mouse over bounds. That's that bounding box that I was talking about here, where when you mouse over this, the mouse over bounds, the left edge of it is halfway between this node and the previous node, and then the right edge is halfway between this node and the node to the right. The quality bounds rectangle, that is based off of the audio parameter. If we scroll a little bit further down, there are some free functions that I've got over here. Compute left corner frequency based on the Q. So if you have a frequency value of 200, like this dot right here, and you have a Q of 0.3, there's math in there which says, all right, the Q value is going to give us a frequency of 50, and then the right side corner is going to give me a frequency value of, it looks like 750 or something. Let's see what it says if I go over here. If I click on these and I click on the dot and I drag this, it says the right frequency. You can see that in the debug output it says it's like 698 or something. All right. And you can see that it's like snapping as well. Again, this is a really tricky problem to solve, and the way I've solved it may not be the most ideal, but it is functional. You know, we're trying to replicate the behavior that is shown in Logic's channel EQ. Okay, all right. All of this stuff is just notifier things. Let's see what's going on here. Okay, this is the update visibilities. And this stuff has to do with whether or not, let's see. Yeah, we did refresh widgets. We covered reorder widgets. And reposition bands, we did that. Create analyzer node area. Remember, that's where I said that like the analyzer node area is basically the bounding box that represents how high you can drag, how low you can drag, and then the left and the right edge all the way to here and to there. Basically where 20 hertz is and where 20 kilohertz is. That's your analyzer node area. Let's see, get filter name. What this does is it just basically pulls the chain position and channel and gives you the parameter name so that way you can look it up in the audio processor value tree state. That's what this find parameter function does, I believe. Let's see. Yeah, that's what that does. Okay. So if it's a frequency param, then it's going to call get parameter. Again, this is based on how I decided to name everything, which may or may not have been ideal, but this solution is the result of that. Okay. I have some helper functions here, which basically says like, if I know I'm doing the frequency, if I know I'm dragging a node and I want the frequency of it, then I'm going to call this find parameter with the frequency type, and that's going to do this thing. And all of this code is basically meant as a means of simplifying how I actually get the ranged audio parameter from it. So you don't need to do it this way. This is just what I did to try to be overly clever and make it so that whenever I'm, let's see, I know there's a place where I'm calling that. That'd be the best way to find it. Let me just do find freq param. Okay, so this is in the node controller constructor. This is where I'm actually calling, this is where I'm like getting the frequency param and I'm setting it somewhere. Or no, this is where I'm creating the parameter attachments after I create the nodes. Okay, that's where this stuff gets used. The visibilities, that has to do with whether or not the, if the parameter itself is bypassed, then we're going to hide all that stuff. We're going to hide the node, we're going to hide the band, and we're going to hide the Q controls for that sort of thing. Let's see, node with mouse over bounds. This is kind of how I organize. This is how I know what I'm clicking on. Let's see, where does this get used? Rebuild node selection bounding boxes. So again, this is where I was doing the, this is where I modified the mouse over bounds of each analyzer node. Yeah, I'm not going to go too deep into that. All right, all of these notify things, these are just using the listener list stuff that we talked about earlier. Hide all bands. This code is used in the mouse exit. Basically, once you leave the mouse editor, you should hide all bands that are currently displayed. You should also deselect all of the nodes. Okay, that's what that stuff is for. And let me go back to here. All right, reposition the Q controls. This just pulls it based off of the, let me see where this is actually called from. Find call hierarchy. Refresh widgets. Yeah, these are just like the default positions. It doesn't really matter because the mouse down and the mouse drag code is what actually modifies the positioning of those guys. Okay, let's talk about these mouse events. All right, in the mouse down, you know that when you click on the node, the band, or the Q, you're going to start a drag, like literally start the component dragger. You're going to start the gesture, and then you're going to notify all the listeners. Okay, if you're in the controller, you're going to do nothing. You're not going to start any gestures, no dragging. You're going to notify the listeners that nothing was clicked on. That's what happens when you do mouse down. For the mouse move function, and I will put all of this information in the actual instructions. If everything is inactive, you're going to highlight the node, you're going to highlight the band, and you're going to notify the listeners. Do the same thing for the band. Okay, if you're in the controller, you're going to display the band under the cursor, and you're going to notify the listeners. If the Q controls are actually active in the mouse move, If you mouse over a node, you're going to highlight the node, you're going to highlight the band, and you're going to notify the listeners. If the node is the same one as the cue control, you're not going to do anything. Otherwise, you're going to hide the cue controls. If you mouse over a band, you're going to highlight the node, you're going to highlight the band, you're going to notify the listeners. If the band is the same one that the cues are on, you're not going to do anything. Otherwise, you're going to hide the cue controls. If you are mousing over a cue control, you are going to highlight the node and the band and the cue, and you're going to notify the listeners. And if you are mousing over the controller, you're going to hide the cue, you're going to highlight the band and the node inside the mouse over bounds, and you're going to notify the listeners. All right, that's mouse move. Let's show what I mean by that. Hide this real quick. Okay, so like I was saying, see how it's showing like multiple bounds because I'm up here. All right, that's what I mean. How if you have inactive well, actually, I'm actually breaking my my rules. It says if you have inactive cue controls and you mouse over the controller, you should display the band under the cursor. So I should be disabling these guys. All right. If I mouse over a band, I'm going to highlight the node and do nothing else. If I have active cue controls, if I mouse over the band, I'm not going to do anything to the cue. If I mouse if it's a different one than the cues, then I'm going to hide the cue controls, which is what I just did right there. All right. And then if I mouse over the cue, I'm going to highlight the cue. I'm going to highlight the cue controls. Highlight both of them, the left cue and the right cue. All right. Now let's go to the mouse up. Okay, mouse up on the node. I'm going to highlight the node. I'm going to highlight the band. I'm going to end the gesture. The gesture is where I'm actually like clicking and dragging this stuff. Okay, if I'm also going to display the cue controls in case I want to mess with those. Again, this is if I have inactive cue controls. For the band, I'm going to highlight the band. I'm going to end the gesture. Again, I can click on the band and drag. All right. And if I mouse up on the controller, I'm not going to do anything. Okay. If the cue controls are active and I mouse up on them, I'm going to end the gesture and I'm going to notify the listeners. If I am mousing up on the band and the cue controls are active, if I mouse up on the band, I'm going to highlight the band, I'm going to end the gesture, I'm also going to highlight the node. And then same for if I'm on the node and I mouse up, I'm going to highlight the node, I'm going to highlight the band, I'm going to end the gesture as well when I'm done dragging and I let go. And notify the listeners. Okay, so now we come to the mouse drag. All right, this one here. If I mouse drag and the cue controls are off, I'm just going to drag the node. I'm going to update the parameters for it, which in this case is the frequency and the gain. And I'm going to notify the listeners, which is going to update the response curve and the sliders down, the sliders that display the frequency values. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing for the band. And then if the cue control is not active, then I'm not going to do anything. Click and drag, it's not going to do anything. All right. If the cue controls are active and I drag the node, I'm going to drag the node, I'm going to update the parameters, I'm going to notify the listeners. Same thing for the band. And then if I drag the cue controls, I'm going to update the cue control parameter only. All right, if the cue controls are active, and if the cue controls are active and I move over here, they get hidden once the cursor goes outside of the cue controls get hidden once I mouse exit out of the band. Okay, this goes to the mouse enter. Mouse enter is pretty obvious. When you enter into a node or a band, you're going to highlight that node and highlight the band. If the cue controls are active, you're going to change the cursor, which that happens automatically in that constructor for the cue control. You're also going to highlight the node, you're going to highlight the cursor, and you're going to highlight, you're going to highlight the node, you're going to highlight the band, and you're going to highlight the cue control. If you mouse enter the controller, you're going to unhighlight everything. The band is still displayed though. All right, that actually might be a bug on my end that I need to look at. All right, mouse exit, you're going to unhighlight the node that was currently being highlighted. So for instance, if I go from here to this one, this node becomes unhighlighted and this band also becomes unhighlighted. And this one becomes highlighted and this band becomes highlighted. Same for here. If I go over here, if I do a mouse exit, it's going to unhighlight everything. If the Q controls are active and I mouse exit them, let's see, what does it do? Q controls are active, and then I mouse exit the Q controls, they get hidden. All right. Okay, that's pretty self-explanatory. Just basically like stop showing the visuals when you mouse exit one of the bands. And then for mouse double click, this is pretty obvious. If you double click on a node, you're going to reset the frequency gain or the slope. Okay. If you double click on a band, don't do anything. If you double click on the controller, don't do anything. If the Q controls are active, double click on the node is going to reset the frequency and the gain. And if you double click on the Q, you're going to reset the Q. Let's see, let's adjust this Q. All right, if I double click on the Q, that resets it back to its default value. Okay, that's basically how this thing works. Final tips, you are always going to want to make the dots in front of the bands. You're always going to want to make the Q controls be on top of the nodes, I believe, when they are visible, or when they are not when they're not visible. Don't worry about them, obviously. I'm going to finish adding all the stuff to the instructions, but for the most part, that's basically how this thing works. The order of operations is mouse enter followed by a mouse down, and then if you drag, it goes to mouse drag, and then when you let up the cursor, you get a mouse exit, or you get a mouse up, and then when you actually leave the bounds of a component, you're going to do a mouse exit. Let me go to this constructor, because the big important thing to do is in this constructor, first you make your node, and then you add the node controller as a mouse listener, so that way the node, any mouse events that happen on the node the notifications happen in the node controller. Do the same thing for the band. Okay, any mouse events that happen in the bands get sent to the node controller. All right, so that way the node controller is kind of the hub that coordinates everything. Yeah, those are like the big moving parts. Okay, left control and right Q control, same thing. All right, any mouse events that happen on those components get handled by the node controller. The problem that creates is that you need a way of figuring out which component was clicked on in the mouse events, because we've got node controller. Let's see, we've got the node controller creating mouse events whenever you mouse over it. You've got the nodes themselves, the analyzer nodes, the analyzer bands, and the Q controls all creating different mouse events. So again, that's what this widget type pair class and this get component from mouse event function solves that problem. So once you get that mouse event, once you get the component for a particular mouse event, you can then switch based off of that component's type and handle that mouse event accordingly. That's what all of this stuff is breaking down. And I already showed it, but I'll just show it one more time in like the mouse down. First thing we do is we get that widget type pair. And then we say, okay, which type is it? It's a node. All right, here's what I'm going to do for the node. All right, it's a band. Here's what I'm going to do for the band. All right, it's a quality control. Here's what I'm going to do for that. All right, it's the controller. Here's what I'm going to do for that. And then Here's the others, right? Here's if it's an invalid type, and here's if it's end of list. Okay, these are just kind of like safety things. Okay, that should be enough information for how this thing works that you'll be able to figure out how to get your own version of this working. Good luck. This is a beast to put together, but if you can figure this out, you're ready for the real world. All right. Good luck, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you come up with.